The phone call came at 8:17 on a rainy Thursday morning. I remember the exact time because I had been staring at the kitchen clock for nearly an hour, unable to sleep. The house smelled faintly of coffee, and outside the apartment window a cold Virginia drizzle painted the world gray. When I answered, all I heard at first was screaming. Not angry screaming. Panicked screaming. The kind of sound a man makes when his world suddenly collapses. "Sarah, what did you do?" I recognized the voice immediately. Brian, my husband of 27 years. The man who had sold the house I spent 16 years earning through military service. The man who drained our daughter's college fund. The man who vanished with his mistress while I was serving my country. For a few seconds I simply sat there holding the phone. I didn't say a word. I just listened. And for the first time in months I smiled. Not because I enjoyed hearing him suffer, but because I finally knew Emily had been right. We had handled it. 3 months earlier, I had stepped off a military shuttle at Norfolk Naval Station believing I was coming home. At 54 years old, I wasn't some young officer anymore. The years had left their marks. Gray hairs, a bad knee, a shoulder that ached whenever the weather changed. 16 years of military service had taught me discipline, resilience, and sacrifice. But it had also cost me birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, and countless evenings with my family. Still, I never regretted serving. Not once. Because every deployment, every long assignment, every missed celebration was supposed to build something better for the people I loved. For Brian, for our daughter Emily, for our future. That morning I was carrying a small duffel bag and looking forward to nothing more exciting than sleeping in my own bed. I had even called Brian from the airport. No answer. That wasn't unusual. He sometimes ignored his phone. I figured he was busy. The drive from Norfolk to our neighborhood took about 45 minutes. As I turned onto our street, I felt the familiar comfort of home. The old maple trees. The white fences. The quiet suburban neighborhood where we'd spent nearly 20 years. Then I noticed the moving truck. At first I assumed a neighbor was relocating. Then I saw the address, my house. I pulled over so hard my tires squealed. 2 men were carrying furniture out the front door. Furniture that belonged to me. My heart started pounding. I climbed out of the car and hurried across the lawn. "What are you doing?" I shouted. One of the movers looked confused. "We're moving in the new owners." I laughed, actually laughed, because the statement was so absurd. "What new owners?" The younger mover frowned. "The people who bought the house." I stared at him, then at the house, then back at him. "What are you talking about? I own this house." The mover shifted uncomfortably. A woman appeared in the doorway. She looked to be in her 30s. Friendly smile, holding a set of keys. The keys to my house. "Ma'am," she said gently, "are you Sarah Mitchell?" My stomach dropped. "Yes." Her expression changed instantly. Oh my God. The next few minutes felt like a dream. Or maybe a nightmare. She explained that she and her husband had legally purchased the property 6 weeks earlier. All paperwork had cleared. The sale had been finalized. Everything was official. I couldn't process the words. I simply stood there in the driveway while rain began collecting on my jacket. The house. My house. Gone. I don't remember driving away. I only remember pulling into a gas station parking lot and sitting behind the wheel for nearly an hour. My hands shook. I called Brian. Straight to voicemail. Again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. Then I called Emily. My daughter answered immediately. "Mom." The moment I heard her voice, I broke. I don't mean tears. I mean complete emotional collapse. The kind that comes after years of holding everything together. The kind that leaves you gasping for air. "Sweetheart," I whispered. "What happened?" "He sold the house." Silence. Then a long sigh. Not surprise. Not confusion. A sigh. Almost like she had expected this. "Where are you?" she asked calmly. Emily met me an hour later. She was 22 years old. Smart. Level-headed. Far wiser than I had been at her age. She found me sitting inside a diner near Interstate 64. I hadn't touched my coffee. When she sat across from me, she immediately reached for my hand. "Mom." I looked at her. "How?" That was all I could manage. How? How could a man I'd spent nearly 3 decades loving do something like this? Emily squeezed my fingers. Then she said something that frightened me. "There's more." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" She opened her laptop. A few clicks later, she turned the screen toward me. Bank statements, account records, transaction histories, numbers, thousands, then tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. Money disappearing. Transfer after transfer. Withdrawal after withdrawal. I stared at the screen. No, Emily nodded slowly. He emptied the college fund. The words hit harder than losing the house. Because the money wasn't for me. It was for her. Years of careful saving. Birthday deposits. Holiday contributions. Military bonuses. Everything. Gone. How much, I whispered. Almost all of it. I felt physically sick. Emily had worked hard her entire life. Straight A student. Scholarships. Part-time jobs. She deserved security. Instead, her own father had stolen it. I buried my face in my hands. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, I asked the question I had been avoiding. Where is he? Emily looked away. Then she answered quietly. Florida. I closed my eyes. Of course. Florida. Warm beaches, retirement communities, new beginnings. Apparently, Brian had decided to start one without us. With her, Emily nodded. Crystal, the mistress. 32 years old, a woman younger than our marriage. I felt humiliation wash over me. Not because he left, because everyone else seemed to know before I did. The neighbors, the bank, the real estate agents, maybe half the state of Virginia. Everyone except me. The fool serving overseas while her husband dismantled her life piece by piece. I stared out the diner window as rain slid down the glass. Everything I'd worked for felt gone. The house. The savings. The future I'd imagined. All of it. Then something unexpected happened. Emily smiled. Not a happy smile. Not a cruel smile. A knowing smile. A smile that suggested she understood something I didn't. She closed the laptop, leaned back, and smirked. Mom, she said. Don't worry. I blinked. What? Her smile widened. We handled it. For the first time all day, I forgot about my own pain. Because suddenly I had a new question. What exactly had my daughter done? I stared at Emily for several seconds. The noise of the diner faded into the background. The clatter of dishes. The murmur of conversations. The waitress refilling coffee cups. Everything seemed distant. Because my daughter had just said something that made absolutely no sense. We handled it. Not we'll handle it. Not we can fix it. Past tense. Handled. As if she already knew something I didn't. As if the disaster that had just destroyed my life was somehow part of a plan. I shook my head. Emily, what are you talking about? She glanced around the diner. Not here. Emily, trust me, Mom. There was something in her voice. Calm. Confident. Almost reassuring. For the first time since discovering the house was gone, I felt a tiny spark of curiosity pushing against the despair. Maybe because I had raised her myself. I knew that expression. Emily never acted dramatic. Never exaggerated. If she looked that calm, there was a reason. An hour later, we were sitting in the guest room of my younger sister Karen's house. Karen had immediately offered me a place to stay after hearing what happened. She was furious. More furious than I was. If Brian walks through that door, she had announced, I'll personally throw him back to Florida. Under different circumstances, I might have laughed. But at the moment, I felt emotionally exhausted. Emily sat at the small desk near the window. Her laptop was open. Several folders covered the screen. Documents. Spreadsheets. Emails. Bank records. I frowned. What is all this? Emily took a deep breath. Mom, before I explain, I need you to understand something. My stomach tightened. Okay. I didn't discover this last week. I blinked. What? She hesitated. I discovered it almost 10 months ago. The room suddenly felt very quiet. 10 months? She nodded. I stared at her. Why didn't you tell me? Pain crossed her face. Because at first I wasn't sure. I sat down slowly. Emily folded her hands. I started noticing things last year. What things? Dad's behavior. I said nothing. She continued. He started spending more money. How much more? A lot. She opened one of the files. Restaurant charges. Hotel charges. Jewelry purchases. Weekend trips. Expenses I had never seen before. My chest tightened. I recognized some of the dates. Dates when I had been away on assignment. Dates when Brian had told me he was staying home. Working. Relaxing. Watching football. Instead, he had apparently been entertaining another woman. Emily looked at me carefully. I know this hurts. I nodded silently. It hurt more than I wanted to admit. Not because of the affair itself. At my age, life teaches you that people are imperfect. People fail. People make terrible choices. What hurt was the deception. The ease with which Brian had lied. The casualness of it. 27 years together. And apparently he could look me in the eye and invent entire stories without feeling guilty. Emily opened another file. This is where I got suspicious. The screen displayed several bank transfers. Large transfers. Thousands of dollars at a time. My eyes widened. Where did that money go? We're still tracking all of it. I stared at the numbers. Many of the transfers originated from accounts funded primarily through my military salary. Over 16 years. Deployment bonuses. Housing allowances. Savings contributions. Retirement investments. The money represented countless sacrifices. Birthdays missed. Anniversaries skipped. Christmas mornings spent overseas. Every transfer felt like watching pieces of my life disappear. Emily leaned forward. Mom, do you remember last summer when Dad suddenly became interested in handling all the finances? I thought back. Slowly. Then remembered. Brian had insisted he wanted to simplify things. At the time, it sounded reasonable. I had trusted him completely. I remember. Emily nodded. That's when it started. A wave of shame washed over me. Military officers are trained to identify risks. We assess situations, analyze threats, plan contingencies. Yet somehow I had failed to see the danger sitting at my own dinner table. The next revelation hurt even more. Emily clicked on a folder labeled Crystal. My stomach sank. Photos appeared. Restaurant photos, vacation photos, social media screenshots, messages, hundreds of messages. Evidence of a relationship that stretched back much farther than I imagined. This long, I whispered. Emily nodded. At least 2 years. 2 years. For 2 years, Brian had been living a double life. While I was serving in uniform, while I was planning retirement, while I was discussing our future, he had already been planning his exit. I rubbed my temples. Part of me didn't even want to know more. But Emily wasn't finished. Mom, there's something else. I looked up. The house. My pulse quickened. What about it? She exchanged a glance with Karen. That worried me immediately. Emily, the paperwork doesn't look right. I sat up straighter. What do you mean? We're not sure yet. Emily. She turned the laptop around. Several scanned documents filled the screen. Closing documents. Property disclosures, sale records, legal forms. My signature appeared repeatedly. Except, something felt wrong. Very wrong. I leaned closer. The signatures looked similar, but not identical. Not quite. The spacing, the pressure, the slant. Years of signing military paperwork had made me familiar with my own handwriting. Those signatures didn't feel natural. A chill moved through me. You think he forged them? Emily chose her words carefully. I'm saying a lawyer should review everything. Karen crossed her arms. I've already talked to one. I looked at her. You what? Karen nodded. The day Emily called me. I stared at both of them. Suddenly a realization hit me. They had been working together. For months. Maybe longer. While I remained completely unaware. Wait. I looked at Emily. What exactly have you been doing? For the first time she smiled. Not smugly. Not proudly. Just confidently. The way a capable adult smiles when she knows she's prepared. A lot. Over the next 2 hours, Emily explained everything. The more she talked, the more stunned I became. She hadn't simply gathered evidence. She had built a case. When she first became suspicious, she confided in Karen. Together, they quietly began documenting irregularities. Every unusual transfer. Every suspicious expense. Every inconsistency. Eventually, they consulted a retired military attorney named Richard Dawson, a man who had spent decades helping service members navigate legal disputes. Richard immediately recognized potential problems, especially involving military earnings and marital assets. Then came another unexpected ally, my longtime financial advisor, a cautious man named Walter Jenkins. Walter had known our family for nearly 15 years. When Emily approached him privately, he couldn't discuss account details, but he could explain warning signs, patterns, red flags, questions she should ask. Finally, a family friend working in banking compliance reviewed publicly available information and identified additional concerns. Not illegal activity, just enough unusual behavior to justify closer scrutiny. As Emily spoke, a picture slowly emerged. Brian thought he was secretly dismantling our financial life. What he didn't know was that 3 intelligent women and several experienced professionals had quietly been documenting every step. I felt something I hadn't felt all day. Hope. Tiny. Fragile. But real. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I asked softly. Emily looked down. For the first time, her confidence cracked. I didn't want to distract you while you were serving. My eyes filled with tears. She continued. You spent your whole life protecting us. Her voice trembled. I wanted to protect you for once. The room fell silent. I reached across the table and took her hand. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Emily stood up. She walked to a nearby filing cabinet, opened a drawer, and removed a thick folder, several inches thick, packed with documents, evidence, records, research, preparation. She placed it in front of me. I stared at it, then at her. Emily smiled. The same mysterious smile from the diner. Mom, she said, Dad thinks he won. I swallowed. She tapped the folder. That's exactly why he's about to lose everything. For the first time since discovering that my house was gone, I slept through the night. Not because my problems had disappeared. They hadn't. The house was still sold. The college fund was still missing. My husband was still somewhere in Florida with a woman half his age. But something had changed. For the first time, I wasn't completely helpless. Emily's folder sat on the nightstand beside me, a thick stack of evidence that proved I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining things, and most importantly, I wasn't alone. The following Monday morning, I met Richard Dawson, the retired military attorney Emily had mentioned. Richard was in his late 60s, gray hair, reading glasses, calm voice, the kind of man who seemed impossible to rattle. His office overlooked a small marina near Hampton Roads. Photos of military families covered the walls. As soon as I sat down, he handed me a cup of coffee. Sarah Mitchell. I nodded. He smiled. I've heard wonderful things about your daughter. I laughed softly. So have I. Richard opened a file. A very familiar file. Emily's file. He adjusted his glasses. Before we discuss legal options, I want you to understand something. I braced myself. Okay. What happened to you was not your fault. The words hit harder than expected. For months I had been blaming myself. How could I not? I was supposed to be intelligent, disciplined, observant. Yet somehow I had missed an affair that lasted years. Missed financial theft. Missed the sale of my own house. Richard seemed to read my thoughts. I've represented military families for 30 years, he said. You know what I've learned? What? The people who betray trust are usually experts at hiding it. I sat quietly. He continued. Your husband spent years creating a false reality. I nodded slowly. That sounded painfully accurate. Richard opened several documents. There are a few issues that concern me. My stomach tightened. The house. He pointed to several pages. The signatures need professional review. I felt my pulse quicken. You think they're forged? I think they deserve scrutiny. Typical lawyer answer. Careful. Measured. But even that cautious statement gave me hope. He flipped through more paperwork. There are also questions regarding disclosure requirements. What does that mean? It means buyers, lenders, and title companies rely on accurate information. I leaned forward. And if the information wasn't accurate, Richard closed the folder. Then people start asking questions. For the first time in weeks, I smiled. Not a big smile. Just enough. Meanwhile, Brian was apparently living his best life. At least according to social media. Emily showed me screenshots. Photos from Florida. Luxury restaurants. Beachfront sunsets. Expensive cocktails. Weekend boat trips. Crystal appeared in nearly every picture. Young. Attractive. Perfectly posed. The comments underneath made my stomach turn. Living the dream. So happy for you. You deserve this. Brian had created an entirely new version of himself. A version where he was some brave man chasing happiness. Not a husband who abandoned his family. Not a father who emptied his daughter's college fund. Just a middle-aged man reinventing himself. I should have been furious. Oddly enough, I wasn't. Mostly I felt sad. Because the man in those photos looked ridiculous. Like someone desperately trying to convince the world he was happy. Maybe even trying to convince himself. 3 weeks later, the first crack appeared. Emily called me while I was helping Karen plant flowers. Mom, her voice sounded excited. What happened? One of Dad's accounts was frozen. I straightened immediately. What? Temporary review. My heart started pounding. Are you serious? Completely. The review didn't prove wrongdoing. It didn't mean anyone had been charged with anything, but it meant questions were being asked. And questions were exactly what Brian feared. A few days later, another problem surfaced. The attorney representing the home sale requested additional documentation. More questions. More paperwork. More scrutiny. Each new request forced Brian to explain things he probably assumed nobody would examine. Emily smiled when she heard the news. He thought everything would be automatic. What do you mean? He thought once he left Virginia nobody would fight back. I suspected she was right. Brian had always preferred easy victories. Then came the phone call from Walter Jenkins, my financial advisor. Sarah, I wanted to update you. I immediately sat down. Please tell me something good. He chuckled. I have some encouraging news. For the next 15 minutes, he carefully explained several developments. Nothing dramatic, nothing sensational, but enough to reassure me that professionals were paying attention. Records were being reviewed. Transfers were being traced. Questions were being answered. For months, I had felt powerless. Now the machine was moving. Slowly, methodically, relentlessly, just like the military. And I knew from experience that patient systems often accomplished more than emotional reactions ever could. Meanwhile, Brian's fantasy life continued, at least on the surface. But Emily kept hearing things through mutual acquaintances. Small things, subtle things, the kinds of details people accidentally reveal. Apparently, Crystal had expensive tastes. Very expensive tastes. Designer handbags, luxury vacations, upscale restaurants, constant spending. At first, Brian seemed happy to provide it. Why wouldn't he? He believed he had won. He had a large pile of cash, a younger girlfriend, a fresh start. But money has a funny way of disappearing when people spend it trying to impress someone else. The withdrawals became larger. The purchases became more frequent. The lifestyle became harder to maintain. And underneath it all, uncertainty was growing. Because every week seemed to bring another question, another review, another request for documentation, another reminder that the past wasn't staying buried. One evening, Emily and I sat on Karen's back porch watching the sunset. The air smelled like fresh-cut grass. For the first time in months, life felt almost normal. Almost. Emily sipped iced tea. I watched fireflies blink across the yard. You know what's strange? I said. What? I don't hate him. She looked surprised. Really? I nodded. I thought I would. Then what do you feel? I considered the question carefully. Disappointed. The answer came easier than expected. Because it was true. Brian wasn't some evil mastermind. He wasn't a movie villain. He was a deeply flawed man who made selfish choices. Choices that hurt people who loved him. And sooner or later, selfish choices always create consequences. Emily nodded slowly. I think that's why this is bothering him. What is... He expected anger. I frowned. He didn't expect accountability. The statement lingered in my mind. Because it felt exactly right. Brian knew how to defend himself against arguments. Against emotional confrontations. Against guilt. What he wasn't prepared for was documentation. Evidence. Facts. Paper trails. Reality. About a month later, the illusion finally began to crack in a way even Brian couldn't ignore. Richard called me early on a Tuesday morning. His voice sounded unusually upbeat. Sarah, I think you should sit down. My heart immediately started racing. What happened? We've received additional findings. I sat. Fast. Good findings. Very good findings. I gripped the phone. Richard continued. Let's just say your husband is about to have a very uncomfortable few weeks. For several seconds I couldn't speak. Not because I was celebrating, but because I suddenly realized something. The process was working. Not revenge. Not anger. Not vengeance. Truth. Truth was working. And somewhere in Florida, the man who thought he had escaped was beginning to understand that his perfect new life wasn't nearly as secure as he believed. The first time I truly believed Brian's world was falling apart wasn't when an account was frozen. It wasn't when lawyers started asking questions. And it wasn't when Richard called with good news. It was when I stopped checking my phone every morning. For months, I'd been waking up with a knot in my stomach. Every day began with anxiety. What had he taken now? What new disaster was waiting? What surprise would arrive in the mail? But sometime during that summer, I noticed something strange. The fear was fading. Not because my situation had improved overnight. It hadn't. The legal process was still moving at the speed of government paperwork, which is to say very slowly, but emotionally something had shifted. I was no longer surviving. I was rebuilding. One Saturday morning, Emily and I attended a veterans' breakfast in Hampton. It had been years since I'd gone to one. Military life has a funny way of keeping you busy even after you've earned a chance to slow down. The room was filled with men and women around my age. Some older, some younger. Retired Navy, Army, Air Force. Marines, Coast Guard. People who understood sacrifice without needing explanations. I hadn't planned to talk about Brian. In fact, I wanted to avoid the subject entirely. But word travels quickly in military communities. Before long, someone asked how I was doing. Then another. And another. To my surprise, nobody pitied me. Nobody treated me like a victim. Instead, they reminded me of things I'd forgotten. The people I'd mentored. The sailors I'd helped. The younger officers I'd trained. The families I'd supported. One retired chief petty officer shook my hand and said something I'll never forget. "Sarah, one bad man doesn't erase a good life." I smiled politely at the time. But the sentence stayed with me, because for months I'd allowed Brian's betrayal to define everything, as if 27 years of marriage somehow outweighed 54 years of living. As if one terrible chapter erased all the good ones. Maybe it didn't. Maybe it couldn't. Meanwhile, the pressure around Brian continued growing. Not dramatically. Not in some movie-style explosion. Real life rarely works that way. Instead, it happened through dozens of small consequences. Richard explained it best. People think collapse happens all at once. We were reviewing documents in his office. It doesn't, he smiled. Usually collapse happens one bill at a time. Turns out he was right. One bill at a time. One problem at a time. One uncomfortable conversation at a time. That was how Brian's fantasy life started unraveling. Emily continued hearing updates through mutual friends. Apparently, Crystal had become increasingly frustrated. At first, she'd enjoyed the lifestyle. The condo, the trips, the expensive dinners, the gifts. But maintaining that lifestyle required money. And money was becoming harder to access. Questions kept appearing. Transactions took longer. Lawyers kept contacting people. Documents kept arriving. The carefree future Brian had promised her suddenly looked far less certain. One afternoon, Emily showed me a social media post. Crystal standing alone on a beach. No Brian. No smiling couple photos. No luxury captions. Just a sunset and a vague quote about finding your own path. Emily raised an eyebrow. Trouble in paradise. I laughed. For the first time in months, a genuine laugh. Maybe. The truth was, I no longer cared much about Crystal. She wasn't the reason my marriage failed. She was simply the person standing at the finish line when Brian decided to abandon his responsibilities. The real issue had always been Brian's choices. As summer turned into fall, another development changed everything. The document review finally came back. Richard called me immediately. "Sarah, are you sitting down?" That question again. This time I laughed. Should I be? Probably. I sat. My heart started racing. What did they find? There was a brief pause. Then Richard answered. Several signatures raised serious concerns. I closed my eyes. Not because I was shocked. Because hearing it confirmed felt overwhelming. Months earlier it had been a suspicion. Now professionals were questioning the documents too. How serious? Serious enough that additional investigation is justified. For several moments neither of us spoke. Then Richard said something unexpected. "Your daughter deserves a lot of credit." I smiled. "I know." "No, Sarah, you really don't." I listened quietly. If Emily hadn't documented everything, much of this would have been impossible to establish. After the call ended, I sat alone in Karen's kitchen, thinking about my daughter. The little girl who used to sleep with stuffed animals. The teenager who worried about math tests. The young woman who somehow found the strength to protect me while I was busy protecting everyone else. I felt incredibly proud. About 2 weeks later, the biggest crack appeared. Crystal left. Not dramatically. No screaming matches. No public scenes. She simply left. According to what we heard later, she'd finally realized the truth. Brian wasn't the wealthy, carefree man she imagined. He was a middle-aged man drowning in legal problems. The money wasn't endless. The future wasn't secure. And the exciting adventure she'd signed up for was becoming increasingly complicated. One morning she packed her things and moved out. Just like that. Gone. When Emily told me, I felt absolutely nothing. No satisfaction. No celebration. Just emptiness. Because despite everything, the situation was sad. An entire family destroyed. A marriage ended. A reputation damaged. Years of trust thrown away. Nobody really wins in situations like that. Some people simply lose more than others. Several days later, I received a call from someone I hadn't heard from in months. Brian's older brother, Frank. We'd always gotten along. He sounded tired. "Sarah." "Hello, Frank." There was a long pause. Finally, he sighed. "I wanted you to know something." "What?" "Brian's not doing well." I looked out the window. Autumn leaves were beginning to cover Karen's yard. "What do you mean?" He's alone. I said nothing. Frank continued. Crystal left. I heard. He didn't think she would. Of course he didn't. People rarely imagine consequences while they're making selfish decisions. They only notice them after the damage is done. Frank lowered his voice. I don't think he understands how this happened. That statement almost made me laugh. How this happened? The answer seemed obvious. It happened one lie at a time. One betrayal at a time. One selfish decision at a time. Exactly the same way trust gets destroyed. Slowly, then suddenly. That evening Emily and I sat on Karen's porch again. The same porch where we'd spent countless nights talking through the crisis. The air was cooler now. Fall had arrived. Emily looked at me carefully. How are you feeling? I thought about it. Really thought about it. Then I answered honestly. Better. She smiled. Good. I looked toward the darkening sky. For months I'd imagined that revenge would feel triumphant, that I'd experience some overwhelming sense of victory. But the reality was different. What I felt wasn't victory. It was peace, because I was finally understanding something important. Brian's downfall wasn't my accomplishment. It was simply the natural result of his own choices. And for the first time since returning from Norfolk, I wasn't focused on what I'd lost. I was focused on what remained. My daughter, my integrity, my future. And those things turned out to be worth far more than the house he'd stolen. By the time winter arrived, I no longer measured my life by what Brian had taken. I measured it by what I had rebuilt. That realization surprised me, because when I first returned from Norfolk and found strangers living in my house, I honestly believed my life was over. Not literally, but emotionally. The future I'd spent decades building had vanished almost overnight. At 54 years old, I wasn't interested in starting over. Most people my age aren't. We spend our younger years building stability precisely so we don't have to start from scratch later. Yet somehow there I was, living in my sister's guest room, sorting through legal paperwork, trying to imagine a future I had never planned for. And somehow, against all odds, life kept moving forward. The final hearings began in early December. Richard had warned me not to expect dramatic courtroom scenes. No television moments, he said. No surprise witnesses. No dramatic confessions. He was right. Most of it was paperwork, documentation, financial records, expert reviews, legal arguments. Slow, methodical, boring if I'm being honest, but beneath all that paperwork sat one simple truth. Facts, and facts have a stubborn way of surviving. The evidence Emily collected months earlier had become the foundation for everything. Every transfer, every withdrawal, every questionable document, every inconsistency. One by one they formed a picture that was difficult to ignore. I attended several meetings, answered questions, provided records, clarified timelines. Nothing glamorous, just truth. The entire experience reminded me of military investigations. People often expect dramatic breakthroughs. Instead, real investigations usually involve patient professionals examining details until the truth becomes unavoidable. That was exactly what happened here. One afternoon, Richard invited me to his office. The marina outside was covered in gray clouds. Winter winds pushed small waves against the docks. As soon as I entered, I noticed something different. Richard looked relaxed. Very relaxed. For a lawyer, that was unusual. He motioned toward a chair. Sit down, Sarah. I laughed. Every time you say that, my blood pressure goes up. He chuckled. This time it's good news. I sat immediately. Richard opened a folder. Several matters have now been resolved. My heart began pounding. He continued. The college fund. I held my breath. What about it? A substantial portion has been recovered. For several seconds I couldn't speak. The relief hit me harder than expected. Not because of the money itself, because of what it represented. Emily's future. Opportunities. Security. Possibilities. Things a parent wants for their child. My eyes filled with tears. Richard smiled gently. I thought you'd like that. I nodded, unable to speak. Then he continued. There are additional settlements regarding marital assets. More good news. More corrections. More accountability. Not perfect. Nothing could fully undo the damage, but enough. Enough to restore fairness. Enough to restore dignity. Enough to remind me that truth still matters. When I told Emily, she cried, which shocked me. My daughter rarely cried. Even as a child. Even during difficult times, she had always been the steady one, the practical one, the strong one. Yet, as soon as I told her about the college fund, tears rolled down her cheeks. I pulled her into a hug. Sweetheart. She laughed through the tears. I know. We stood there in Karen's kitchen for nearly a minute, neither of us saying much. Sometimes relief doesn't need words. Oh, a few days later Frank called again. Brian's brother. His voice sounded heavier than before. Worse, I asked. Frank sighed. Much worse. I listened quietly. Apparently Brian's financial situation had deteriorated significantly. Legal costs, settlements, fees, lost assets. The numbers had finally caught up with him. For months he had been operating under one dangerous assumption, that he could outdistance consequences, that if he moved far enough away and started a new life quickly enough, the past would simply disappear. Life doesn't work that way. Eventually reality arrives, and reality had finally arrived in Florida. The call came 3 days before Christmas, at exactly 8:17 in the morning. The same call I remembered every time I looked at a clock. The same call I had opened this story with. My phone rang while I was sitting alone at Karen's kitchen table. Outside, cold rain tapped softly against the windows. I almost didn't answer. The number wasn't familiar. Then curiosity got the better of me. Hello? What followed was several seconds of chaos. Heavy breathing. Panic. Then shouting. Sarah. Brian. I recognized him instantly. The confidence was gone. The arrogance was gone. The self-assurance that had carried him through the previous year had vanished completely. What did you do? I remained silent. What did you do? He shouted again. His voice cracked. For a moment I almost didn't recognize him. This wasn't the man who had confidently walked away. This wasn't the man smiling in beach photos. This wasn't the man who believed he'd won. This sounded like someone terrified. I finally spoke. What are you talking about? You know exactly what I'm talking about. His breathing grew heavier. The judgment. The final judgment. Of course. The paperwork had reached him. The consequences were now official. No more delays. No more uncertainty. No more fantasies. Just reality. I leaned back in my chair. Oddly enough, I felt calm. Very calm. What happened, Brian? The question seemed to anger him. You took everything. I almost laughed. Everything? Number. I hadn't taken anything. I simply reclaimed what never should have been stolen. But I didn't say that. Instead, I listened. For several minutes, Brian vented, complained, blamed, rambled. The words poured out like water from a broken pipe. At first, I felt anger, then disappointment, then something unexpected. Pity. Because underneath all the frustration, I heard something else. Fear. The man was scared. Not of prison, not of public embarrassment, not even of financial loss. He was scared because he finally understood what he'd destroyed. His marriage, his relationship with Emily, his reputation, his future. And unlike money, some losses can't be recovered. Eventually his voice softened. The anger faded. Silence filled the line. Then he asked a question so quietly I almost missed it. Did I ruin everything? I closed my eyes. 27 years together. Countless memories. Good years, bad years, ordinary years. A lifetime reduced to one heartbreaking question. Did I ruin everything? For a long moment neither of us spoke. Then I answered honestly, You ruined a lot, Brian. The silence returned. Heavy, painful, necessary. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I sensed something I hadn't heard before. Genuine regret. After I hung up the phone, I sat alone at Karen's kitchen table for a very long time. The rain continued tapping against the windows. The coffee in my mug had gone cold. And for the first time in nearly a year, there was nothing left to fight. No new documents, no new investigations, no new surprises. The truth had finally reached its destination. I should have felt victorious. Honestly, that was what I'd imagined for months. I imagined some glorious moment when Brian would finally get exactly what he deserved. I imagined satisfaction, closure, maybe even celebration. Instead, I felt tired, not exhausted, just finished. Like a soldier returning home after a long deployment. The mission was complete. The battle was over. Now it was time to decide what came next. A week after Christmas, Richard called. Everything is finalized. I smiled. That's good. It is. There was a pause. Then he asked a question. What are you going to do now? I laughed softly. What do you mean? I mean with your life. For months, my entire world had revolved around recovery. Recovery of assets, recovery of truth, recovery of dignity. But Richard was right. The recovery phase was ending. Life was beginning again. And suddenly I wasn't entirely sure what that looked like. The answer came from an unexpected place, Emily. One evening she came into Karen's living room carrying a notebook. She sat beside me on the couch. "Mom." "Yeah, I have an idea." I smiled. Emily always had ideas. "What is it?" She opened the notebook. Inside were pages of handwritten notes, travel destinations, housing options, retirement goals, volunteer opportunities, community programs. I looked at her in confusion. "What is all this?" She grinned. "Your future." I laughed. "My future?" "Yes." She pointed to the notebook. "You spent 16 years serving other people." Another page. "You spent 27 years taking care of Dad." Another page. "You spent 22 years raising me." I felt my eyes beginning to water. Emily squeezed my hand. "Maybe it's finally your turn." For several moments I couldn't speak, because she was right. For the first time in decades I had choices. Not obligations. Not responsibilities. Choices. The realization felt both terrifying and exciting. A few weeks later I received another phone call. This time it wasn't Brian. It was Frank. "He's asking to see you." I stared out the window. The winter sky was clear. Cold. Peaceful. I had known this moment would eventually arrive. "What do you think?" Frank asked. I considered the question carefully. Months earlier, my answer would have been simple. Number. Absolutely not. But months earlier, I was still angry. Now things were different. "I'll think about it." And I did. For nearly a week. The meeting took place in early February. A public park near Williamsburg. Neutral ground. Safe. Simple. I arrived first. The morning air was cold enough to sting my cheeks. Children played in the distance. A few people walked dogs along nearby trails. Normal life. Ordinary life. The kind of life that continues no matter what happens to us. Then I saw Brian, walking slowly toward the bench. For a moment I barely recognized him. Not because he'd aged dramatically, because the confidence was gone. The man approaching me looked smaller somehow. Humbled. Human. When he reached the bench, neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, he sat down. "Thank you for coming." I nodded. The silence lingered. Then Brian looked down at his hands. "I don't expect forgiveness." His voice sounded different. Quieter. More honest. "I don't even know if I deserve it." I listened. For once, he wasn't trying to defend himself. Wasn't making excuses. Wasn't blaming anyone else. He continued. "I thought I was chasing happiness." I said nothing. I convinced myself I deserved more. His eyes filled with tears. And somewhere along the way I stopped seeing what I already had. For the first time in many months I saw genuine remorse. Not fear. Not self-pity. Remorse. There is a difference. A big difference. Fear focuses on consequences. Remorse focuses on damage. And Brian finally seemed to understand the damage. A few minutes later Emily arrived. That part surprised him. He stood immediately. My daughter looked calm. Strong. Confident. Just as she had been throughout the entire ordeal. Brian struggled to meet her eyes. "I owe you an apology." Emily nodded. "You do." No anger. No cruelty. Just truth. The same truth that had carried us through everything. Brian swallowed hard. "I'm sorry." Emily remained quiet. Then she asked a question. A simple question. "Why?" For several seconds Brian couldn't answer. Eventually he spoke. "I got selfish." There was no dramatic speech. No elaborate explanation. Just the truth. Simple. Painful. Accurate. I got selfish. The entire disaster reduced to 4 words. And perhaps that was enough. We talked for nearly an hour. Not about money. Not about legal matters. Not about blame. Those issues were settled. Instead we talked about family. Mistakes. Regret. Healing. The things that actually matter when life reaches a certain age. Eventually Brian looked at me. His eyes were red. "Can you ever forgive me?" The question hung in the cold air. I thought about everything. The house. The affair. The stolen money. The lies. The betrayal. Then I thought about something else. Carrying anger forever. Living inside bitterness. Allowing someone else's mistake to poison the years I still had left. I didn't want that life. I looked directly at him. "Yes." Brian's eyes widened. "Yes." I nodded. "I forgive you." Tears rolled down his face. But before he could speak, I continued. "Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened." His shoulders lowered. "I know. It doesn't mean I trust you. I understand. It doesn't mean things go back to the way they were." He nodded again. "Because some doors close permanently. And that's okay. Forgiveness isn't the same thing as forgetting. Sometimes forgiveness simply means choosing peace over resentment. Nothing more, nothing less. Over the following months, limited contact slowly returned. Carefully, gradually, mostly through Emily. There was no magical reunion, no sudden restoration of the marriage. Life isn't a Hallmark movie. But there was healing, real healing. The kind that happens one honest conversation at a time, one responsible choice at a time, one day at a time. And surprisingly, that was enough. Today, when people ask what I learned from all of this, I usually tell them the same thing. Military service taught me discipline. It taught me courage. It taught me sacrifice. But this experience taught me something even harder. Character matters more than circumstances. Money can disappear. Homes can be sold. Plans can collapse. People can betray you. Yet integrity remains. And integrity is what ultimately carries us through life's worst storms. Brian lost sight of that. Emily never did. And watching my daughter protect our family during its darkest season remains one of the proudest moments of my life. If you've ever been betrayed, disappointed, or forced to rebuild after someone else's choices, I hope this story reminds you of something important. The people who hurt us do not get to define us. The worst chapter of your life does not have to become the final chapter. And sometimes when everything seems lost, the strength you need is already standing beside you. In my case, she was my daughter. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on the people who stood by you during difficult times. And if you'd like, share your own experience in the comments. Stories of resilience help remind us that none of us walks through life's hardships alone. And if you'd like to hear more stories about family courage, forgiveness, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe. At the will, reading my dad declared the penthouse and Tesla go to your brother, not you. I didn't blink. I didn't argue. I just folded my hands in my lap, looked him straight in the eye, and said, calm as still water. Keep it all. A few people in the room shifted in their seats. Someone near the back let out a quiet, confused laugh like they weren't sure if they'd heard me right. My brother leaned back, smiling. Not a cruel smile, not exactly. Just satisfied. Like everything had finally fallen into place the way it was always supposed to. My father nodded once as if my response confirmed something he had believed about me for years. She understands, he said, glancing toward the attorney. She's always been independent. Independent. That was the word he used. Not overlooked, not dismissed, not forgotten. Independent. I could feel the weight of every eye in that room pressing against me, extended family neighbors, 2 of my father's business associates, and a couple of people I didn't even recognize. They were all waiting for something. A reaction. A crack. But I had learned a long time ago how to hold still when everything inside me was shifting. They thought I'd lost my mind. They didn't know I'd already won. My father adjusted his tie, the same small, precise motion he'd made my entire life whenever he felt in control of a situation. He glanced down at the document in front of him, then at the attorney. Well, he said almost casually, that should settle everything. The attorney didn't answer right away. He was an older man, mid-60s, maybe thin, careful, with a voice that always sounded like it had something more behind it than what he actually said. He flipped a page. Paused. Then he cleared his throat. Mr. Whitaker, he said, measured and professional, there is an additional document your father left behind. The room changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. My brother's smile faltered just slightly. My father frowned. What do you mean, he asked. The attorney adjusted his glasses. A separate directive. It was filed independently and is to be read after the primary will. There was a silence then. The kind that doesn't come from confusion, but from something deeper, something people don't quite understand yet, but feel shifting under their feet. I sat there, hands still folded, breathing steady, because I knew, or at least I suspected. And for the first time that morning, I allowed myself to remember his voice. You don't need their approval, my grandfather had told me once. Just become someone they can't ignore. I'm 35 years old. A commissioned officer in the United States Navy. I've spent most of my adult life away from this town, away from this house, this table, these conversations that always seemed to circle around things I was never quite part of. My brother stayed. He built a business with my father, expanded it, made it profitable. He was visible. He was present. He was understandable. I wasn't. When I left for the military, my father didn't stop me. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He just said, if that's what you want. And that was it. No pride. No concern. Just quiet acceptance, as if I'd chosen something temporary, something that would eventually pass. It never did. My grandfather was the only one who ever asked me why. Not in a demanding way, not like he was trying to test me. He asked because he wanted to understand. We used to sit on his back porch in the late afternoons when the sun dipped low enough to soften everything. He'd pour 2 glasses of iced tea too sweet for my taste, but I never said anything and we'd talk. You ever notice he said once how people respect what they can see? I nodded. They see your brother's office, his car, his numbers. That makes sense to them. He tapped the side of his glass lightly. But service, that's harder. It doesn't show up in the same way. I remember looking at him then, trying to decide if he was warning me or encouraging me. What if they never see it? I asked. He smiled, not a big smile, just something small and certain. Then you make sure it's worth it anyway. The day I told my family I was enlisting, my brother laughed. Not harshly, just surprised. You, he said, you're serious. My father didn't laugh. He just leaned back in his chair studying me like I was a problem he hadn't quite figured out yet. It's a hard life, he said. I know. You'll be gone most of the time. I know. He nodded once. Then he looked past me toward the window. Well, he said, it's your decision. That was the moment I understood something I didn't have words for yet. I wasn't stepping away from them. I had never really been standing where they were to begin with. My grandfather drove me to the recruiter's office. He didn't say much on the way, just kept both hands steady on the wheel, eyes forward. When we pulled into the parking lot, he reached into his jacket and pulled out an old watch. It wasn't expensive, you could tell that just by looking at it. But it was clean, maintained, cared for. This was mine, he said. Wore it for 30 years. I hesitated. I can't take that. He pressed it into my hand anyway. You're not taking it, he said. You're carrying it. I looked down at it, then back at him. Why me? He held my gaze for a moment. Because you understand the difference. Years passed. Deployments came and went. Promotions, 2 quiet ones, earned the long way. I missed holidays, birthdays, dinners that from what I heard later weren't much different without me. I sent money home sometimes, not because they asked, just because it felt like something you do for family. No one ever mentioned it. My father would talk about my brother's latest expansion, his new clients, his plans. When he spoke about me, it was usually brief. She's doing fine, he'd say. Fine. The last time I spoke to my grandfather, I was standing outside a base in Virginia, the wind cutting sharp across the pavement. He sounded tired. But clear. How are you holding up? He asked. I'm good, I said, just busy. He chuckled softly. Busy's a good thing. There was a pause. Then he said something I didn't expect. I'm proud of you. I closed my eyes for a second. Thank you, I said. We talked a little longer, nothing important, just small things. When the call ended, I told myself I'd call him back in a few days. I didn't. By the time I did, it was too late. I didn't make it home for his funeral. Duty didn't allow it. That's the phrase they use. As if it explains everything. Maybe it does. Maybe it doesn't. A week later, I received a letter. Handwritten. Short. Stand tall, even when no one's watching. That was all it said. No signature. It didn't need one. Now I was sitting in that same town again. In a room full of people who had never quite known what to do with me. Listening to my father distribute everything he believed mattered. And realizing he hadn't changed. Not really. But maybe he was about to. Because the attorney was still holding that second document. And for the first time in a very long time. My father looked uncertain. I didn't move when the attorney lifted the second document. For a moment, no one did. It was a strange kind of stillness, like the air had shifted but hadn't quite settled yet. My father's hand rested flat against the table, fingers spread just slightly as if grounding himself in something solid. What is that? He asked. His voice wasn't sharp, it wasn't demanding. It was unfamiliar. The attorney glanced down, then back up. This, he said carefully, is a separate directive filed by your father, Mr. Whitaker. It is to be read in full without interruption. My brother let out a quiet breath through his nose, almost amused again, trying to recover that earlier confidence. Well, he said lightly, I guess Grandpa had one more thing to say. No one laughed this time. I kept my eyes on the attorney's hands. The way he handled the paper, slow, deliberate, told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't an afterthought. This mattered. My grandfather never rushed anything. Not conversations, not decisions, not even silence. Especially not silence. He used to say that silence was where people showed you who they really were when they weren't trying to fill the space. We spent a lot of those silences together. On his porch, in his truck, sitting side by side watching the world move without feeling the need to explain it. You ever notice he said once how most people talk so they won't have to think? I smiled. You talk less than anyone I know. That's because I already did my thinking, he said. He was a quiet man. Worked with his hands most of his life, fixed things, built things, took care of what was his without making a show of it. When I was a kid, I thought that meant he didn't have much. It took me years to realize he had more than anyone else in that family. He just didn't measure it the same way. The attorney unfolded the paper. Before I begin, he said I need to clarify that this directive establishes a trust and outlines specific responsibilities assigned by the decedent. My father straightened. A trust, he repeated. Yes, sir. My brother leaned forward slightly, now interest replacing ease. What kind of trust, he asked. The attorney didn't answer right away. Instead, he began to read. I, Thomas Whitaker, being of sound mind. The words were formal, legal, structured. But beneath them, if you knew how to listen, there was something else. Something human. I remembered the first time my grandfather showed me how to fix a broken hinge. I must have been 10. He didn't take the tool from my hand when I struggled, didn't step in when I got frustrated. He just stood there beside me. You'll get it, he said. I'm doing it wrong, I snapped. He shook his head. You're doing it your way, that's different. I tried again. Slower this time. When it finally worked, I looked up at him, waiting. He nodded once. That's it. No applause, no big reaction. Just recognition. And somehow, that meant more. This trust is to be named the Whitaker Service Fund. There was a small shift in the room. Not loud, not dramatic, but noticeable. My brother's brow furrowed. My father's expression tightened. Its purpose shall be to provide financial assistance and support to veterans and their families. Someone near the back whispered something under their breath. I didn't turn to see who. With an emphasis on those who have served without recognition or adequate support upon return to civilian life. My throat tightened slightly. Not from surprise. From understanding. He never talked about his own service. Not really. I knew he'd served, knew he'd seen things he didn't share. But he never wore it like a badge. He carried it like something private. Something earned but not displayed. The management and full discretionary control of this trust shall be granted to my granddaughter. The attorney paused. Just for a second. Then he looked up. Emily Whitaker. Every head in the room turned. I didn't move. Didn't react. But I could feel it, that shift. The one I'd felt my whole life, just reversed. My brother blinked. Wait, he said. What? My father didn't speak. He was looking at me now. Really looking? For the first time in a long time. This decision is made with full confidence in her judgment, character, and understanding of service. The attorney continued, his voice steady. Qualities which I have observed consistently throughout her life. I closed my eyes briefly. Just for a second. Because I could hear it. Not the attorney's voice. His. You don't need them to understand, my grandfather had told me once. We were sitting in his truck that day, rain tapping softly against the windshield. You just need to understand yourself. What if that's not enough, I asked. He looked at me calm as ever. It will be, he said, eventually. Along with the trust, I leave a personal letter to be read aloud at this time. The attorney lowered the document slightly, then reached for a second page. My father shifted in his seat. This is unnecessary, he said quietly. The attorney didn't respond. He just began to read. If you are hearing this, then I am gone. And if I know this family the way I believe I do, then there is already a misunderstanding in the room. A few people exchanged glances. My brother leaned back again, but there was no smile now. I have watched each of you build your lives in your own way. Some of you have built with numbers, some with presence, and one of you," the attorney paused briefly, "has built with sacrifice." The room was silent, completely silent. "Emily, he read you chose a path that does not always come with recognition. That is the nature of it." I felt something shift in my chest. Not pain. Not quite. Something older. Deeper. Your family may not always understand what you have given, not because they do not care, but because they measure differently. My father's jaw tightened. "I am leaving you this responsibility not as a burden but as acknowledgement." The word hung there. Acknowledgement. "You have already proven that you do not need more to carry. What you deserve," a pause, "is to be seen." The attorney lowered the paper. No one spoke. No one moved. I kept my hands folded in my lap. Just like before. But something had changed. Not in the room. Not yet. But in the way they were looking at me. My brother exhaled slowly. "So, what she gets a charity," he said, trying to make sense of it. The attorney answered calmly. "She receives full control of a funded trust with significant assets." That landed differently. My father finally spoke. "How significant?" he asked. The attorney met his eyes. "Enough to matter." Silence again. But this time it wasn't empty. It was full. Full of something none of them had expected to face. I looked down at my hands. Then at the old watch on my wrist. Still ticking. Still steady. Just like he always was. And for the first time since I walked into that room, I realized something clearly. I hadn't just been given something. I had been recognized. The room didn't recover right away. It just sat there with what had been said. You could feel it settling into people differently, some trying to understand it, some trying to measure it, and a few trying to decide whether it mattered at all. My father was still looking at me. Not with anger, not even with disappointment. With something quieter. Something that didn't have a name yet. The attorney gathered the pages, aligning the edges carefully as if the order of things still mattered. "If there are no further questions," he said, "we can proceed with the formal transfer process in the coming weeks." My brother leaned forward. "I have a question," he said. Of course he did. "How is this funded?" he asked. "I mean, where is the money coming from?" The attorney met his gaze without hesitation. "Your grandfather allocated a portion of his private holdings to establish the trust," he said. "Investments, land interests, and several long-term accounts." My brother blinked. "That's not possible," he said. "We went over everything." "You reviewed the primary estate," the attorney replied. "This was structured separately." I could see it then, the moment my brother realized something had existed in that family that he hadn't been part of. Not excluded. Just never invited into. We left the house in small groups. People always do that after something uncomfortable. They don't leave all at once. They break apart quietly, like a gathering that no longer knows what it's supposed to be. A few relatives stopped me on the way out. "Congratulations," one of them said, though it didn't quite sound like congratulations. "That's..." something another added, unsure of the word. I nodded politely. "Thank you." That was enough. It always had been. The air outside felt different. Cooler, cleaner. I stood on the front steps for a moment, letting it settle. This house had never quite felt like mine. Even growing up, it had always belonged more to the idea of a family than to the people inside it. My brother's voice came from behind me. "So," he said. I turned. He had his hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly tense. "That was unexpected," he added. "It was," I said. He studied me for a second. "You knew?" he asked. I shook my head. "Number." He frowned. "But you didn't seem surprised." I considered that. "I wasn't," I said. He looked away down the driveway. "I don't get it," he said. "Why you?" There was no accusation in it. Just confusion. I could have given him an answer. Explained the years, the distance, the choices. But none of that would have made sense to him, not in the way he needed it to. So I just said, "You'd have to ask him." My brother let out a quiet breath. "Yeah," he said. "Guess I can't do that anymore." My father didn't come outside right away. I didn't expect him to. He was the kind of man who needed time not to feel something, but to understand what it meant. I walked down the steps and toward the driveway. My car was parked along the curb, same place it had been when I arrived that morning. Nothing about it had changed. And yet everything had. The drive back took me past the old roads I used to know by heart. The grocery store on the corner, the gas station where my grandfather used to stop every Friday. The small park where nothing ever seemed to happen but where everything felt remembered. I pulled over once. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. The watch on my wrist caught the light as I turned the steering wheel. Still ticking. Still steady. The first time I wore that watch on base, one of the younger officers noticed it. "Nice piece," he said. "Where'd you get it?" "My grandfather," I told him. He nodded, impressed. "Looks old." "It is." He smiled. "Still works, though." I looked down at it. "Yeah," I said, "it does." Military life isn't what most people think it is. It's not constant action. It's not glory. It's routine. Responsibility. Long stretches of quiet work that no one ever hears about. You wake up early, you follow orders, you lead when it's your turn, you take care of the people under you. And you learn over time that recognition isn't part of the job description. That's not why you do it. But there are moments. Small ones. When someone looks at you, not for what you rank, not for what you've done on paper, but for how you carry yourself. Those moments stay with you. They build something. Not visible, but real. I remember one deployment where things didn't go the way they were supposed to. Nothing dramatic, nothing anyone would write about. Just a situation that required someone to stay steady when others couldn't. After it was over, one of the enlisted men came up to me. "Ma'am," he said, "thank you." "For what?" I asked. He shrugged. "For not making it worse." I almost laughed. But I didn't. Because I understood what he meant. Sometimes doing your job well means not adding to the problem. Sometimes that's enough. My family never saw those moments. They didn't see the long hours, the quiet decisions, the responsibility that didn't come with applause. They saw absence, distance, a life they couldn't measure. I didn't blame them. Not really. You can't expect someone to value what they don't understand. But my grandfather did. He didn't need to see everything. He just needed to know who I was. I drove a little farther before pulling into a small parking lot near the edge of town. There was a bench there overlooking a stretch of open field that hadn't changed in years. I sat down. For the first time that day, I let myself exhale fully. The trust. The letter. The way the room had shifted. It wasn't about winning. Not in the way they thought. I hadn't taken anything from them. I hadn't proven them wrong. Not directly. But something had changed. Something quiet. Something that couldn't be undone. I took the letter out of my bag. The one the attorney had handed me after everything ended. I hadn't read it again yet. Not properly. I unfolded it carefully. The paper felt different in my hands than it had in that room. More personal. More real. "Emily," it began. No formal tone this time. Just my name. "You may not realize it yet, but the life you chose has already shaped more people than you will ever meet." I paused there. Let it settle. There will be times when it feels like no one is watching, like what you do doesn't reach beyond the moment. I looked out across the field. The wind moved through the grass in slow, steady waves. But impact is not always visible, and recognition is not always immediate. I swallowed. What matters is that you continue anyway. I folded the letter slowly. Held it for a moment, then placed it back in my bag. The sun was starting to lower, casting long shadows across the ground. I stood up, took one last look at the field, then walked back to my car, because whatever came next, it wasn't about what I had been given. It was about what I was going to do with it. I didn't go back to the house that evening. There wasn't anything there I needed. Not anymore. Instead, I checked into a small hotel just off the highway, the kind with faded carpet, quiet hallways, and a front desk clerk who barely looked up when you walked in. It was the same place I'd stayed a few times over the years when visits home didn't quite feel like coming home. Some things don't change, and sometimes that's a relief. I set my bag down on the chair by the window. The room smelled faintly of old air conditioning and detergent. Outside, the sky was turning that soft gray blue that comes just before night settles in. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, still in my uniform, hands resting on my knees. The silence didn't feel heavy. Just honest. There's a kind of quiet you learn to live with in the military. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of distraction. You learn to sit with your thoughts. You learn not to run from them. And eventually you learn which ones matter. That night only one thought stayed. Not about the trust. Not about the will. But about something my father had said years ago, something I hadn't thought about in a long time. You don't need anything from us. At the time I had taken it as dismissal. A quiet way of saying I wasn't part of what they were building. But now sitting there alone I realized something different. He hadn't meant to push me away. He had simply placed me somewhere else. Somewhere he didn't know how to reach. The next morning I woke early. Old habits don't fade. I got dressed, checked out, and drove back toward town, not to the house, but to the one place that had always made sense to me. My grandfather's. It was smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I was just seeing it clearly for the first time. The paint had faded along the edges of the porch. The railing leaned slightly where it always had. The yard was still neat, though someone had been taking care of it. I parked along the side and walked up the steps. They creaked in the same places. I noticed that. I always noticed things like that. The front door was locked. Of course it was. But I didn't try to open it. I just stood there for a moment looking at it. Remembering. He used to leave it unlocked during the day. Said there was no reason to keep people out if you weren't afraid of anything inside. I never knew if that was wisdom or just the way he chose to live. Maybe both. I walked around to the back. The porch was still there, same 2 chairs, same small table between them. One of the chairs had a slight tilt to it, the one he always sat in. I stepped onto the porch and sat down. The wood creaked under my weight. For a second it felt like nothing had changed. I figured you'd come here. I turned. My father stood at the edge of the yard. Hands at his sides, no jacket, no tie. Just him. I wasn't sure if you would, I said. He nodded once. I wasn't sure either. He took a few steps closer, then stopped, not quite ready to come all the way up. We stood there like that for a moment. The distance between us wasn't large, but it felt familiar. I didn't know about the trust, he said. I know. He looked at the porch, then at me. He never mentioned it. I nodded. He didn't mention a lot of things. My father exhaled slowly. That's not how I do things. No, I said, it's not. He stepped closer this time. 1 foot on the first step, but no further. I thought I understood him, he said. I didn't answer, because I wasn't sure what that would sound like. I thought I understood you too, he added. That got my attention. I looked at him. Really looked. There was something different in his expression now. Not certainty. Not control. Something closer to doubt. I didn't think you needed anything, he said. There it was again. That same sentence. But it didn't sound the same anymore. I didn't, I said. He frowned slightly. Then why does this feel like I missed something? I held his gaze. Because you did. He didn't react right away. Didn't defend himself. Didn't argue. He just stood there letting that settle. I gave your brother what I thought mattered, he said after a moment. I know. And you, he paused, you chose something else. Yes. He nodded slowly. I thought that meant you were separate from all this. I glanced around the yard. The house. The porch. This was never really mine, I said. He looked at me confused. It was your home. It was your home, I corrected gently. And his. The words weren't sharp. They didn't need to be. My father stepped up onto the porch, then finally closing the distance. He didn't sit. Just stood beside me, looking out at the yard the same way I was. I didn't know how to measure what you were doing, he admitted. That felt closer to the truth. You weren't supposed to, I said. He turned slightly. Then what was I supposed to do? I thought about that. Not quickly. Not easily. Ask, I said. He looked away. Toward the fence line. Toward the place where the yard met the open field beyond it. I thought giving you space was respect, he said. It can be, I replied. But not when it replaces understanding. He was quiet again. Longer this time. I watched your brother build something I could see, he said. And I watched you leave. I nodded. That's what it looked like. He let out a breath. But I never asked where you were going. That was it. That was the moment. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just clear. I didn't need more from you, I said after a while. He looked at me again. Then what did you need? I met his eyes. Not angry. Not hurt. Just honest. To be seen. The words stayed between us. Not heavy, but real. My father didn't answer right away. He just nodded. Once. Slowly. I see you now, he said. I didn't respond. Because that kind of thing, it doesn't come from words. It comes from what happens next. The wind moved through the yard again, brushing against the porch, carrying that same quiet I had always known here. My father looked around one more time. Then back at me. What are you going to do with it? He asked. I followed his gaze out toward the field. Toward something bigger than this house. This town. This moment. I'm going to use it, I said. And for the first time since I'd come back. That answer felt like mine. The paperwork began the following Monday. Not all at once, not dramatically, just a series of meetings, signatures, quiet conversations, the kind of work that builds something real without ever drawing attention to itself. I stayed in town longer than I'd planned. Not because I had to, but because this mattered. The attorney's office was smaller than I expected. Wood-paneled walls, old framed certificates, a desk that looked like it had held decades of decisions that didn't need to be explained to anyone else. He greeted me with a firm handshake. Ms. Whitaker, he said, I'm glad you came in. So am I replied. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. Let's talk about what your grandfather left you. He didn't rush. That was the first thing I noticed. He explained everything carefully, how the trust had been built, where the funds were held, how the structure worked. It wasn't just a single account. It was layered. Planned. Intentional. Your grandfather began this nearly 10 years ago, he said. I looked up. Then, he nodded. Small at first, then consistent. He added to it regularly. I sat back slightly. 10 years. That meant he had started this long before his health declined, long before anyone thought about wills or estates. He had been building this quietly, while the rest of us were living our lives unaware. He never mentioned it, I said. The attorney smiled faintly. That seems consistent with what I knew of him. He slid a folder across the desk. Inside were documents, detailed records, investment summaries, notes. But what caught my attention wasn't the numbers. It was the purpose. This isn't just a financial structure, he said. It's a mission. I nodded. I understand that. He studied me for a moment. I believe you do, he said. There were conditions, of course. Not restrictive ones. Guiding ones. The fund was designed to support veterans transitioning back into civilian life, especially those who didn't have strong family support. Housing assistance, job training, emergency support. Nothing excessive. Nothing showy. Just practical help. The kind that actually makes a difference. He was very clear about one thing, the attorney added. What's that? I asked. That this fund should never become performative. I almost smiled. That sounds like him. The meetings continued throughout the week. Account managers, advisors, a small board that had been quietly assembled. People who had known my grandfather in different ways, some from his past, some from his later years. All of them steady. No one treated me like an outsider. No one questioned why I was there. They simply included me. On Wednesday, we visited one of the properties tied to the trust. A modest building on the edge of town. Nothing impressive from the outside. But inside, it was already being used. A small group of veterans sat in a common room talking quietly. Coffee on the table, papers spread out. One of them looked up as we entered. Ma'am, he said, nodding. I nodded back. Morning. The attorney spoke with the coordinator, giving me space to observe. I noticed things. The way people sat. The way they held themselves. The small, almost invisible tension that comes from adjusting to a life that doesn't move the same way anymore. I recognized it. Because I had felt it. One of the men stood up and walked over. Mid-40s maybe, worn but not broken. You new here, he asked? I shook my head. Not exactly. He nodded like that made sense. Place helps, he said after a moment. How so? I asked. He shrugged. Gives you somewhere to land. Somewhere to land. I repeated that in my head. Because that was exactly what this was. Not a solution. Not a fix. Just a place to start again. Later that afternoon, the attorney handed me a set of finalized documents. This will formally transfer operational control to you, he said. I took them. Felt the weight of them. Not heavy. But significant. Are you ready for this? He asked. I looked at the pages. Then at him. I've been ready for a long time, I said. He nodded. I believe that. The signing itself was quiet. No audience. No announcement. Just a pen. A name. And a responsibility that had been waiting for me long before I knew it existed. When it was done, I sat there for a moment. Not moving. Not thinking. Just present. You understand, the attorney said gently, that this isn't something you complete. It's something you continue. I nodded. I know. He stood extending his hand. Then I think your grandfather chose well. That evening I drove back to the house. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. My father was in the living room when I walked in. No TV on. No papers in his hands. Just sitting there. You're still in town, he said. I am. He nodded. We didn't talk right away. Didn't need to. How did it go? He asked after a while. Good, I said. That's good. He looked at me then. Not quickly. Not casually. But with intention. What exactly is it? He asked. I thought about how to answer that. Not in terms he would expect, but in terms he could understand. It's support, I said. For people who don't always have it. He nodded slowly. And you're in charge of that now. Yes. Another pause. That's a lot of responsibility, he said. It is. He leaned back slightly, studying me again. But this time, there was no confusion. Your grandfather always believed in things I didn't fully understand, he said. I didn't respond. I just let him continue. I thought I was building something solid, he said. You were. He shook his head slightly. But I think he was building something lasting. That stayed with me. Because there's a difference between something that holds value and something that carries meaning. I think you're right, I said. He looked at me again, then nodded. And for the first time, there was no distance in it. The first real decision didn't come with a meeting. It came with a phone call. Late Thursday afternoon. I was still in town going over final notes with the coordinator from the center we'd visited earlier in the week. My phone rang. Unknown number. I stepped outside to take it. This is Whitaker, I said. There was a pause on the other end. Not hesitation, just someone deciding how to begin. Ma'am, a voice said, my name's Daniel Ruiz. I was given your number through the fund. I leaned slightly against the railing. Yes, Mr. Ruiz, how can I help? Another pause. I'm not sure, he said honestly. I was told, you might be able to point me in the right direction. That more than anything told me exactly where he was. We talked for about 15 minutes. He didn't tell me everything. People rarely do on the first call. But he told me enough. Former Army. Recently discharged. No steady housing. A job lined up, but it didn't start for another 3 weeks. He wasn't asking for much. Just time. I've got a place I can stay for a couple nights, he said. After that, I'm not sure. I looked out across the parking lot. Thought about the building we'd visited. The empty room I'd noticed near the back. You're in town, I asked. Yes, ma'am. Come by tomorrow morning, I said. 9 o'clock. Another pause. Are you sure, he asked? Yes. His voice softened slightly. Thank you. After the call ended, I stayed where I was for a moment. Not thinking about policy. Not thinking about structure. Just thinking about him. This was what my grandfather had built. Not a concept. Not an idea. A place where someone could call and not be turned away. The next morning I arrived early. Old habit. I walked through the building checking things not because I didn't trust the people there, but because I needed to understand how it felt when it was quiet. When it wasn't performing for anyone. Daniel arrived at 8:57. I noticed that. Clean clothes, worn boots, carried himself straight but with that same quiet tension I'd seen before. He hesitated slightly at the door. I walked over. "Mr. Ruiz." He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "Come on in." We sat down at a small table near the window. No paperwork yet. No forms. Just conversation. "Tell me what you need," I said. He took a breath. "Just somewhere to stay," he said. "A couple weeks. I've got a job starting soon. I just need to get there." I nodded. "You will." He looked at me unsure. "You don't know that," he said. I met his gaze. "Yes," I said, "I do." We got him set up in less than an hour. Temporary housing, access to meals, a small stipend to bridge the gap. Nothing excessive. Everything necessary. As he was leaving the office, he paused. Turned back. "I appreciate this," he said. "You don't owe us anything," I replied. He shook his head slightly. "Still," he said, "it matters." After he left, I stood by the window for a while, watching him walk across the lot. Shoulders a little lighter. Steps a little more certain. That was the moment it became real. Not the signing. Not the documents. This. Later that afternoon, my brother called. I hadn't expected that. I answered anyway. "Hey," he said. "Hey." A pause. "I've been thinking," he added. I figured. He let out a small breath. "About everything, the will, the trust, all of it." I didn't interrupt. "I didn't realize how much he had set aside," he said. "He planned ahead," I replied. "Yeah," he said, "he did." Another pause. "I got the penthouse," he said finally. "And the Tesla." "Yes." "It's a lot," he said. "It is. But it doesn't feel the way I thought it would." I didn't answer right away. Because I knew that feeling. "What does it feel like?" I asked. He hesitated. "Like I got what I wanted," he said. But not what he meant. That was honest. More honest than I expected. "He didn't choose against you," I said. "I know," he replied quickly. I think I know." "He chose based on what he believed each of us needed," I added. There was a long silence on the line. "I don't know if I needed this," my brother said. "You might," I said. "Or you might learn something from it." He gave a quiet laugh. "That sounds like something he would have said." "It does," I agreed. Another pause. Then, "What you're doing with that fund," he said, "that's different." "It is." "I went by the building yesterday," he admitted. I raised an eyebrow slightly. "You did?" "Yeah, I didn't go in, just looked." And I asked. "I didn't understand it," he said. "But I could tell it mattered." That was enough. "You're welcome to come by," I said. He didn't answer right away. "Maybe I will," he said finally. When the call ended, I set the phone down slowly. Things don't change all at once. Not people. Not families. But sometimes they start. That evening, I sat down at my desk in the small office at the center. The same one my grandfather had used. Simple, clean, functional. I opened a new folder. Labeled it. Not with my name. With the funds. Because this wasn't about me. Not really. It was about continuing something that had already begun. And for the first time, I understood what winning actually meant. The first letter came 3 weeks later. Not an official report, not a document. Just a handwritten note folded neatly and left on my desk. I recognized the handwriting before I even opened it. "Danielle Ruiz?" "Ma'am. I started the job this week. It's nothing fancy, warehouse work, early hours. But it's steady. I just wanted to say thank you. Not just for the place to stay. For not making me feel like I had to explain everything. That mattered more than I expected. Ruiz." I read it twice. Then I set it down gently. Not because it was fragile, but because it meant something. People don't always remember what you give them, but they remember how you make them feel while they're receiving it. My grandfather understood that. He never gave in a way that made you feel small. He gave in a way that made you feel steady. By the end of the month, we had helped 7 more. Not dramatic cases, not headlines. Just people in between chapters. A place to land. Time to reset. A quiet hand forward. Word spread the way things like that always do. Slowly. Through conversations. Through trust. One afternoon, a local reporter stopped by. Young, polite, curious. "I heard about the fund," she said. "Would you be willing to talk about it?" I considered that. Not because I didn't want to, but because I knew what my grandfather would have said. Keep it about the people it helps, I replied. She nodded. That's what I was hoping you'd say. The article ran the following Sunday. Simple, respectful, focused. It mentioned the fund, the purpose, a few anonymous stories. And at the end, my name. I didn't think much of it. Until my father called. I saw the paper, he said. Yeah. Yes. A pause. They used your name. They did. Another pause. I didn't know you were doing all of that, he said. I leaned back slightly in my chair. That's kind of the point, I said. He didn't answer right away. I showed it to a few people, he said. That caught my attention. You did? Yes. Another pause. I told them, you were my daughter. The words landed quietly. But they stayed. That's the first time you've said it like that, I said. I know, he replied. There was no defense in his voice. No justification. Just acknowledgement. I should have said it sooner, he added. I looked down at the desk. At the letter still resting there. You can say it now, I said. He exhaled softly. I'm proud of you, he said. The room didn't change. Nothing around me shifted. But something inside me did. Not sharply. Not dramatically. Just settled. Thank you, I said. We stayed on the line for a moment longer. Not talking. Just there. When the call ended, I sat there quietly. The same way I had so many times before. But this time the silence felt different. Not like something missing. Like something complete. A few days later, my brother showed up. No announcement. No call ahead. Just walked through the door of the center looking slightly out of place. I figured I'd come see it, he said. I nodded. Good. He walked slowly through the space. Taking it in. The chairs, the desks, the people. This is what you do now, he asked. This is part of it, I said. He nodded. I always thought success looked different, he admitted. It usually does, I said. We stopped near the window. The same one I had stood by weeks earlier. I used to think you left, he said. I glanced at him. I didn't leave, I said. I just went somewhere you weren't looking. He let out a quiet breath. Yeah, he said. I see that now. We stood there for a while. Not fixing anything? Not rewriting the past. Just understanding it better. That evening, after everyone had gone, I stayed behind. The building was quiet again. The way I preferred it. I sat at the desk. Opened my grandfather's letter one more time. Recognition is not always immediate. I smiled slightly. No, I said quietly. It isn't. I folded the letter carefully. Placed it back where it belonged. Then I looked around the room. At what had been built. At what was continuing. Some people leave money. Some leave property. Some leave things that can be counted, measured, divided. But some leave direction. A way forward. And sometimes, that's the only inheritance that truly lasts. If this story reminded you of someone who quietly carried more than anyone ever noticed, take a moment. Reach out. Tell them you see them. Because sometimes, that's all it takes to change everything. The general's voice cut through the ceremony like a blade. Where did you get that? Every conversation around us stopped. Boots froze mid-step on the polished floor. I felt a dozen eyes land on my hand, the one I hadn't thought twice about that morning. The one wearing my grandfather's ring. I swallowed, suddenly aware of the weight of it. It was my grandfather's, sir. The general didn't blink. His face had gone pale in a way I had only ever seen once before in a combat zone when something went very, very wrong. What was his name, he asked quietly. I told him. And just like that, the room shifted. Not loud, not dramatic, just different. Like the air itself had tightened. The general straightened to his full height. You'll report to my office after this, he said. Then softer, almost to himself, I thought he was gone without anyone left. I stood there in my dress blues, heart pounding, wondering how a man my own family barely showed up to bury could make a general react like that. 3 days earlier, I had stood in a very different kind of silence. The cemetery sat on the edge of Columbus, Ohio, tucked behind a row of aging oak trees that hadn't quite leafed out yet. It was the kind of place people forgot about until they needed it. Quiet, modest, honest. There were no crowds, no long line of cars, just me. I remember looking over my shoulder one last time before the service began, half expecting, half hoping to see my parents' car pulling in late. My mother had always been late. My father would have complained about the drive, but he would have come. But the road stayed empty. The funeral director cleared his throat gently. "We can begin whenever you're ready." I nodded, though I didn't feel ready. I don't think anyone ever is not really. The casket was simple. My grandfather wouldn't have wanted anything fancy. He had never been that kind of man. He lived in a small house on the outskirts of town, fixed things instead of replacing them, and wore the same jackets year after year until the fabric softened with age. To my family, he had been background noise, a responsibility, something to manage. To me, he had been the only one who ever listened. "I'm sorry, it's just me," I said quietly, stepping closer to the casket. I wasn't even sure who I was apologizing to, him or myself. The minister read a few words. Standard, respectful but impersonal. He didn't know my grandfather. There hadn't been much to tell. No one had offered him stories. No one had even tried. When it was time, I stepped forward alone. "I guess I'm the one who talks now," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "You never really liked attention anyway." The breeze picked up slightly, rustling the leaves above us. For a second, it almost felt like an answer. I took a breath. "He fixed my bike when I was 10, I said. Didn't say much while he did it, just showed me how to hold the wrench, told me to watch closely." I smiled faintly. I didn't understand then, but "I think you were teaching me more than just how to fix a chain." I paused, glancing again at the empty rows of chairs behind me. "They should have been here," I said, softer now. "You deserved that." The words hung there heavier than I expected. But there was no one to argue with me, no one to defend their absence. Just silence. When the service ended, the workers moved forward to lower the casket. I stood there, hands at my sides, until it disappeared from view. And then I realized something that hit harder than I was ready for. I was the only one left to remember him. His house still smelled like him. Old wood, coffee, a faint trace of engine oil that never quite washed out of his hands, no matter how many times he scrubbed them. I let myself in with the spare key he'd hidden under the same loose brick for as long as I could remember. He used to joke that if someone really wanted to break in, a key wouldn't stop them anyway. "Better to trust people until they give you a reason not to," he'd said once. I wasn't sure my parents had ever agreed with that. The place was quiet, too quiet. I moved through it, slowly touching things without really thinking. The back of a chair, the edge of the kitchen counter, the old radio he kept by the window. Everything was exactly where he'd left it. Like he might walk back in at any moment. But he wouldn't. I opened the small wooden box on his dresser almost without thinking. I had seen it 100 times, but he'd never made a big deal about what was inside. It wasn't locked. Inside were a few photographs, a folded flag, and the ring. I picked it up carefully. It wasn't flashy, no bright stones or polished shine, just a solid band worn smooth in places with markings I didn't recognize etched along the side. It didn't look like anything special, at least not to anyone who didn't know better. I turned it over in my fingers, feeling the weight of it. "Guess this is coming with me," I murmured. There wasn't anyone else who would take it. I called my parents that night. "They didn't even send flowers," I said, pacing the small living room. "Not even a card." My mother sighed on the other end. "We talked about this. Your father has work, and it's a long drive." "He raised you," I cut in, my voice sharper than I intended. He deserved more than an excuse. There was a pause. "Well," she said finally, "he wasn't exactly easy either." I closed my eyes. That was how they justified it. Always had been. He was quiet, distant, not expressive enough. So they filled in the blanks with their own assumptions. "He wasn't what you think," I said. "You didn't really know him," she replied. Neither did you, I thought, but I didn't say it out loud. Instead, I looked down at the ring now sitting on my coffee table. "I'm going back to base tomorrow," I said. "Already?" she asked. "Yeah." Another pause. "Well, drive safe." That was it. No mention of the funeral, no second thoughts. Just done. The morning I left, I slipped the ring onto my finger without thinking too much about it. It fit. Not perfectly, but close enough. I adjusted it once, then let my hand fall to my side. I didn't know why I was keeping it. Maybe because it was the only thing no one else had claimed. Maybe because it felt wrong to leave it behind. Or maybe because deep down I knew it mattered. I just didn't know how much. Not yet. The general's question stayed with me long after the ceremony ended. Where did you get that? It echoed in my mind as I stood outside the hall at Marine Corps Base Quantico, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. Marines moved past me in quiet clusters, their voices low respectful. No one lingered too long. Except me. I kept my hand at my side, but I could feel the ring like it had its own pulse. Heavy, warmer than it should have been. I turned it slowly with my thumb. Same worn edges, same faint markings I still couldn't quite make out. And yet somehow, not the same. The drive back to base housing had been uneventful, but my thoughts weren't. I hadn't expected anything to come from wearing it. Truth is, I hadn't even thought much about it at all when I slipped it on that morning. It had just felt right. Now I wasn't so sure. The general's reaction wasn't confusion, it wasn't curiosity. It was recognition. That unsettled me more than anything. Later that evening, I sat alone at my small kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of me. The overhead light buzzed faintly, the kind of sound you only notice when everything else is quiet. And everything felt very quiet. I pulled the ring off my finger and set it in the center of the table. For a long time, I just stared at it. "What are you?" I murmured. The markings along the side caught the light differently now. I leaned in closer, narrowing my eyes. They weren't decorative, they looked deliberate. Like they meant something. I reached for my phone and snapped a picture, zooming in on the engraving. Still nothing I recognized. No initials, no dates, no obvious insignia. Just lines, patterns, codes maybe. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. My grandfather had never worn anything flashy. Not watches, not jewelry, not even a proper suit most days. And yet he'd kept this. Worn it enough to smooth the edges. Kept it close. Why? I thought about calling my parents again. Then I thought better of it. They'd already made it clear how much or how little this meant to them. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something. So I did the next best thing. I opened my laptop. An hour later, I had more questions than answers. I tried every combination I could think of: military rings, special forces, insignia, custom engravings. I even pulled up images of United States Navy SEALs rings, comparing shapes and designs. Nothing matched. Most of what I found online was ceremonial: graduation rings, unit rings, recognizable, documented. This wasn't that. This was something else. I closed the laptop with a soft click. "Of course you didn't make it easy," I muttered. That sounded like him. I remembered something then. The wooden box. It was still sitting in my duffel bag, tucked beneath a folded uniform. I'd packed it almost without thinking when I left his house, along with a few photographs and that folded flag. I pulled it out now and set it on the table. Same worn wood, same simple latch. I opened it carefully. Inside, everything was exactly as I'd left it. The photographs first. I picked one up. It was old edges, slightly curled. My grandfather stood beside a truck I didn't recognize, younger than I'd ever seen him. His expression was the same, though calm, unreadable. There was someone else in the background, half out of frame. I frowned, bringing it closer. The face wasn't clear, but the posture, the stance, it felt familiar somehow. Military, maybe. I set the photo aside and reached for the folded flag. It was neatly pressed triangle crisp, the fabric still carrying that faint scent of storage and time. I held it for a moment, then placed it gently back. That left one thing. A small envelope I hadn't paid much attention to before. It was plain, no stamp, no address. Just one word written across the front in careful, steady handwriting. Keep. I felt my throat tighten. He'd meant for someone to find this. For me to find it. I slid my finger under the flap and opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper. And a second, smaller object wrapped in tissue. I unfolded the paper first. The handwriting was the same as the envelope. Simple, direct. If you're reading this, it means I didn't get the chance to explain things the right way. I swallowed my eyes, moving slowly across the page. There are parts of my life I chose not to share. Not because I didn't trust you, but because some things are better carried quietly. That sounded exactly like him. The ring isn't just a keepsake, it's a key. Not one you use on a door, but one that opens conversations most people will never have. My hand tightened slightly around the paper. A man may recognize it, if he does listen to him, and don't let anyone else decide what it means. I exhaled slowly. So the general hadn't just noticed it. He'd known it. I looked at the last line. You don't owe anyone an explanation, not even family. I set the letter down, my mind racing. Then I reached for the small object wrapped in tissue. Carefully, I unwrapped it. Inside was a second ring. This one different. Less worn, sharper edges, a darker finish. And on its face, barely visible unless the light hit it just right, was a symbol. I leaned closer. It wasn't something I recognized from any official insignia. But it carried weight. Authority. Finality. I sat back, both rings now in front of me. My grandfather hadn't just left me a memory. He'd left me something unfinished. The next morning I stood outside the administrative building, both rings in my pocket. The general had told me to report. And now I understood why. I adjusted my uniform, taking a steady breath. I wasn't sure what I was about to walk into. But for the first time since the funeral, I felt something shift inside me. Not confusion. Not grief. Something steadier. Purpose, maybe. I stepped forward and opened the door. The door closed softly behind me, but the sound carried. It always does in buildings like that, old walls, high ceilings, everything echoing just a little longer than you expect. I stood there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust, taking in the quiet order of the place. Framed commendations lined the hallway. Names, dates, operations I recognized and others I didn't. The kind of history that never makes it into headlines but shapes everything underneath. A young lieutenant sat behind a desk near the end of the corridor. He looked up as I approached. "Ma'am," he said, standing, "the general is expecting you." I nodded. "Thank you." He gestured toward a closed door. No nameplate, just a small brass number. That felt intentional. I walked down the hallway, each step measured, not rushed, not hesitant. Just steady. The way I'd been trained. "Enter." The voice came before I knocked. I paused, then pushed the door open. The office was simple. Larger than most, but not extravagant. A desk, a couple of chairs, a bookshelf with neatly arranged binders, and a few framed photographs turned just slightly away from the door. The general stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back. He didn't turn right away. "Close the door," he said. I did. Only then did he face me. Up close, the lines on his face were more visible. Not just age experience, the kind that settles in after decades of decisions most people never have to make. "At ease," he said. I relaxed my posture slightly. His eyes dropped to my hand. "The ring," he said. I slipped it off and held it out. He didn't take it immediately. Instead, he studied it from a distance, like he already knew what he would see but needed to confirm it. Finally, he stepped forward and took it carefully, turning it between his fingers. "Where did you say you got this?" "My grandfather, sir." "And his name?" I told him again. This time he closed his eyes briefly. Not long. Just enough. I served with a man who spoke about him once, he said quietly. Didn't use his real name. None of them did. But the description... He shook his head slightly. "It matches." I felt something tighten in my chest. "What kind of description?" I asked. He looked up at me. "The kind you don't forget." He set the ring down on his desk and walked around it slowly, as if organizing his thoughts. "Your grandfather," he began, "was part of something that doesn't officially exist." I didn't respond. You don't interrupt a general, and you don't interrupt when someone is about to change your understanding of everything. "They operated alongside units like the United States Navy SEALs," he continued, "but they weren't listed under any command you could find in a public record." "Black operations?" I asked carefully. He gave a slight nod. "Deeper than that." The room felt smaller all of a sudden. He was known for two things, the general went on: precision and silence. That didn't surprise me. It fit. He completed missions most teams wouldn't even attempt, he said. And when he came back, he didn't talk about them. Not to his superiors, not to his peers, certainly not to his family. A faint, almost sad smile touched his face. Men like that don't need recognition. They carry their own. I looked down at the ring on his desk. "And this?" I asked. He picked it up again. "This," he said, "isn't a decoration, it's a marker." "A marker for what?" "For those who know," he replied simply. That didn't feel like enough of an answer. But it felt like the only one I was going to get. I reached into my pocket. "There's something else," I said. His eyes sharpened. I placed the second ring on the desk beside the first. For the first time since I'd walked in, he looked unsettled. He didn't touch it right away. "Where did you find that?" he asked. "In a box he left behind, with a letter." The general stared at the second ring for a long moment before finally picking it up. His hand was steady, but his expression wasn't. "I haven't seen one of these in a long time," he said. "What is it?" He exhaled slowly. "Authority." I frowned. "That's not very specific, sir." "It's not meant to be," he replied. He set both rings down side by side. "The first ring tells people your grandfather belonged," he said. "The second," he paused, "the second tells them he mattered." I let that sink in. All those years I said quietly and no one knew. The general's gaze shifted to me. "Are you sure about that?" I thought of my parents. The empty chairs at the funeral. The excuses. If they did, I said they didn't act like it. He nodded once as if he understood more than I had said. "Sometimes people choose not to see what's in front of them," he said. "It's easier that way." He moved back toward the window, looking out across the base. "I was a young officer when I first heard his name," he said. "Not from a report, from another man who owed him his life." I stayed silent. "He said your grandfather walked into a situation that was already lost," the general continued. "No backup, no guarantee he'd make it out." "What happened?" I asked. The general's reflection in the glass didn't move. He made sure everyone else did. A quiet settled over the room. "And him?" I asked. The general finally turned. He always did. I felt a strange mix of pride and something heavier. Regret, maybe. Not mine. Theirs. "My family didn't even come to his funeral," I said before I could stop myself. The words hung there. The general didn't react right away. When he did, his voice was calm. "Then that's something they'll have to live with." He stepped back toward the desk and slid the rings toward me. "Keep them," he said. I wasn't planning on giving them up. A faint hint of approval crossed his face. "Good." I picked them up, closing my hand around both. "They mean something now," I said. "They always did," he corrected gently. "You just didn't have the context." I stood there for a moment, unsure if I was dismissed. The general seemed to read it. "There's one more thing," he said. I waited. "If anyone else asks about those rings," he said, "you don't owe them an explanation." I thought of the letter. "You don't owe anyone an explanation, not even family." I nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." When I stepped back out into the hallway, everything looked the same. Same walls, same framed history. But I didn't feel the same. I reached into my pocket and felt the rings again. Not just metal anymore. Not just something left behind. Something earned. Something carried forward. And for the first time since I'd stood alone at that grave, I didn't feel like I was the only one remembering him. I didn't go straight home. I sat in my car for a long time with the engine off, the late light fading across the windshield, both rings resting in my palm. The bass moved around me in its usual rhythm, vehicles passing, boots on pavement, distant voices carrying and fading, but it all felt slightly removed, like I was watching it from just outside myself. All those years I murmured, closing my fingers around the metal, "And you never said a word." That sounded like him. Quiet, steady, never explaining more than he had to. I leaned back in the seat and let out a slow breath. The general's words kept circling in my head. He belonged, he mattered. I had spent most of my life thinking my grandfather had been overlooked. Now I was starting to understand he had been something else entirely. That night I spread everything out on my kitchen table. The wooden box, the photographs, the folded flag, the letter, the 2 rings. I turned the second ring under the light again, studying the symbol etched into its face. It wasn't decorative, it wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to be recognized. But only by the right people. I reached for the photographs next. There were only a handful. My grandfather had never been one to collect memories on paper. But now that I looked closer, I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to before. He was never the center of the frame. Always slightly off to the side. Partially turned away. As if he had made sure he couldn't be easily identified. I picked up the photo of him by the truck again. This time I focused on the figure in the background. Same posture, same stance I had noticed before. Military. But not standard. There was something about the way he held himself alert, but controlled. Not rigid, not casual. Trained. I set the photo down slowly. You weren't just quiet, I said under my breath. You were careful. The letter lay where I had left it, the words still fresh in my mind. If a man recognizes the ring, listen to him. I had. And now I knew more than I ever had before. But it raised a different question. Why leave it to me? Why not tell someone sooner? I sat back staring at the ceiling for a moment. Maybe he had tried. Maybe no one had listened. The next day I called home again. This time my father answered. Hey, he said, his tone neutral. You back at base? Yeah. A pause. How was the service, he asked. The question landed heavier than I expected. You really want to know, I replied. Another pause. Look, he said, clearing his throat. We already talked about why we couldn't make it. I wasn't asking about that, I said. I was asking if you wanted to know how it felt. Silence. Then quietly, go ahead. I took a breath. It felt empty, I said, because it was. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I stood there by myself, I continued, said goodbye by myself, watched them lower him into the ground by myself. My grip tightened on the edge of the table, and I kept waiting for you to show up. He didn't respond. I kept thinking maybe you'd walk in late, I said, make a comment about traffic, or the weather, something. Still nothing. But you didn't. I let the silence sit there this time. Finally he spoke. He wasn't easy, he said, you know that. I closed my eyes. That's not an answer. It's the truth, he replied a little more firmly now. He didn't talk. He didn't share. Half the time it felt like he didn't even want us around. I looked down at the rings in front of me. You ever think there might have been a reason for that, I asked. What kind of reason, he said. I hesitated. The general's voice echoed in my mind. You don't owe anyone an explanation. But this wasn't about owing. This was about understanding. Do you know what he did before he retired, I asked. He worked on engines, my father said without hesitation. You've seen the garage. No, I said quietly, before that. Another pause. He never said, my father admitted. Did you ever ask? A longer silence this time. I figured if he wanted us to know, he would have told us. I let out a slow breath. He was part of something you wouldn't understand, I said finally. That got his attention. What does that mean? It means, I said carefully, that he wasn't just some quiet old man fixing things in his garage. I could hear the shift on the other end of the line. What are you talking about? He asked. I'm talking about the fact that a general recognized something he left behind, I said, and reacted like it mattered. My father didn't speak right away. When he did, his voice was different. Recognized what? I looked down at the ring. This, I said. We agreed to meet. Not right away. Schedules, distance, life, it all still existed. But there was something else there now. Curiosity. Maybe even a little regret. After the call, I sat there for a long time. I hadn't told him everything. Not about the second ring. Not about the letter. Not about the look on the general's face. That felt earned. Something my grandfather had chosen to pass down. Something I wasn't ready to hand over yet. I picked up the first ring again, sliding it back onto my finger. It settled into place like it belonged there. Then I picked up the second one and held it for a moment before placing it back in the box. Not hidden. Just protected. For now, I said softly. Later that evening, I stepped outside. The air was cooler, the sky just starting to darken. Lights flickered on across the base, one by one, steady and predictable. I thought about the man I had buried. The man my family thought they knew. The man I was only just beginning to understand. You really didn't make this easy, I said with a faint, tired smile. But maybe that had been the point. Not everything worth knowing comes easy. Some things have to be earned. And now for the first time I felt like I was standing at the beginning of something. Not the end. I met my parents the following Saturday at a diner off Route 40, the kind of place that had been there longer than most of the strip around it. Brown vinyl booths, coffee that never quite stopped pouring, waitresses who called everyone hon whether they knew you or not. It was neutral ground. I didn't want to do this in their house where everything turned into old patterns before anyone noticed, and I didn't want to do it at my grandfather's place where the walls still felt like they belonged to him. My mother was already seated when I walked in. My father stood near the register, hands in his jacket pockets, looking like a man who had agreed to something before he had fully decided whether he wanted to be there. When he saw me, he gave a small nod. No hugs, no easy smiles. That was fine. I slid into the booth across from them and set the wooden box on the table between the sugar caddy and the napkin dispenser. My mother looked at it first. "What's that?" she asked. "Something Grandpa left behind," I said. A waitress came over, poured coffee, asked if we needed time with the menus. None of us had opened them. "We're fine," my father said. When she walked away, the quiet returned. I rested my hand on the box. I met with a general after the ceremony. That got both their attention. My mother frowned. "A general?" "He saw Grandpa's ring," I said, "the one I wore." My father leaned back slightly, and he recognized it. No one spoke. I opened the box slowly and took out the first ring, setting it on the table. Then I placed the second one beside it. My mother stared. There were two. "Yes." "Why didn't he ever show us these?" she asked. I looked at her for a moment before answering. Maybe because no one ever stayed still long enough to ask him anything that mattered. She blinked at that hurt crossing her face. I didn't enjoy that, but I didn't take it back. My father picked up the first ring, carefully turning it in his fingers. "So what did this general say?" I folded my hands. "He said Grandpa was part of something that doesn't officially exist. He said he worked alongside SEAL teams, but not in anything you'd find in public records." My mother let out a small breath. "That can't be right." "It is." "How would you know?" my father asked. "Because the general knew his name." That landed. I could see it in the way my father's shoulders shifted, in the way my mother's eyes dropped to the table. "He said other men owed Grandpa their lives," I continued. "He said Grandpa was known for precision and silence, that he went into situations other people wouldn't touch and made sure others came home." The waitress returned with our coffee refill and took one look at our faces before backing off without asking. When she was gone, my mother said quietly, "He never told us any of that." "No," I said, "he didn't." My father set the ring down. "Then, how were we supposed to know?" I leaned forward. "You weren't supposed to know everything I said, but you were supposed to know he mattered." His jaw tightened. "That's not fair." "No," I asked. "He was alone at the end, Dad." My mother looked away. I kept going because now that the truth had started moving, I couldn't stop it. He died in that little house with almost no one checking on him. I buried him by myself. There were empty chairs where his own family should have been. And now I'm sitting here finding out that men at the highest levels of the military still remember him with respect. My voice never got loud. That made it hit harder. "You didn't have to know the details of his service," I said. "You just had to show up." My father stared at the table, not me. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then my mother spoke, her voice thinner than usual. "He made it hard." I looked at her. "In what way?" "He shut down," she said. "After your grandmother died especially. But even before that, you'd ask a question and he'd give you half an answer. You'd try to help and he'd say he didn't need it. You'd invite him over and sometimes he wouldn't come." I let her speak. "It felt like he had already decided we weren't close," she said. "After a while." She swallowed. "After a while it was easier to stop trying." I believed that she believed it. That didn't make it right. "Do you hear yourself?" I asked gently. "You're describing a man who was damaged, private, proud, and aging, not a man who deserved to be abandoned." That one hit my father. He lifted his head sharply, and I saw it in his face before he spoke. "We didn't abandon him," he said. I held his gaze. "You missed his funeral." That ended the argument before it could begin. My father exhaled through his nose and leaned back. Not angry now, just tired. "I told myself I'd visit the next week," he said after a while. "Then something came up. Then another week passed. Then more time. It got harder to explain." There it was. The truth people actually lived with. Not cruelty exactly, just neglect dressed up as postponement. My mother dabbed at one eye with a napkin. I kept meaning to call more. I nodded once, I know. And I did know. That was the worst part. Most family failures didn't come from one monstrous act. They came from 1,000 smaller omissions. I reached into the box and took out the letter. I didn't hand it to them. I just held it. "He left this with the rings," I said. "He wrote that some things were better carried quietly, that if someone recognized the ring, I should listen, and that I didn't owe anyone an explanation, not even family." My father looked at the letter like it might accuse him by name. "Did he mean us?" he asked. "Yes," I said. No one disputed it. Outside the diner window, a truck rumbled past. Somewhere near the kitchen, dishes clattered. Life kept moving the way it always did, even when yours had stopped at one hard truth. My mother looked at the rings again. So he really was. She couldn't quite finish it. "A lot more than any of us knew," I said. My father nodded slowly, almost to himself, and he took it all to the grave. I thought about that. Then I shook my head. "No," I said. "He left enough for someone willing to carry it." That was the first moment either of them looked at me differently that day, not like a daughter talking back, not like the youngest person at the table, like someone standing in the gap they had left open. My coffee had gone cold, but I drank it anyway. For the first time since the funeral, I could feel their guilt settling in, not performative, not dramatic, just real, heavy, late. And late or not, it was a beginning. We didn't say goodbye in the diner so much as we ran out of things we could say without breaking something further. My father paid the bill. My mother hugged me at the door a little tighter than usual, like she wasn't sure when she'd get another chance to do it right. I nodded to my father, and he nodded back. No promises. Just an understanding that something had shifted. Outside, the sky had turned that soft gray you get before rain. I stood by my car for a moment, letting the air settle around me. "Late," I said quietly, "but not nothing." They came to the house 2 days later. My grandfather's place. I had driven out early that morning, unlocked the door, and opened the windows to let in fresh air. It didn't change the smell much, old wood and coffee and thyme, but it softened the edges. I set the wooden box on the kitchen table next to 3 chairs. When I heard their car pull into the gravel driveway, I didn't rush out to meet them. I stayed where I was. Let them come in. The door opened slowly. "Hello," my mother called, her voice uncertain, in a way I hadn't heard since I was a kid. "In the kitchen," I answered. They stepped inside like they were entering a place that didn't belong to them anymore. My father paused just past the doorway, looking around as if he expected everything to be different. It wasn't. That was the point. "He kept it the same," my father said quietly. "He always did," I replied. We stood there for a second, the 3 of us, with all the years between us and all the things we hadn't said yet. Then I pulled out the chairs. "Sit," I said. They did. I opened the box and took out the rings first, placing them side by side on the table. My mother watched them like they might move on their own. "That's the one you wore?" she asked. I nodded. "And the other?" my father asked. "He left it wrapped in the box," I said, "with the letter." I handed the letter to my father this time. He hesitated before taking it, like he understood that whatever was written there might not be easy to carry. "Read it out loud," I said. He looked up at me, surprised. "Why?" "Because he didn't say things out loud when he had the chance," I said. "We're not making that mistake again." My father studied my face for a moment, then unfolded the paper. His voice was steady at first. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't get the chance to explain things the right way." By the second paragraph, it wasn't as steady. My mother covered her mouth with her hand as he read the line about carrying things quietly. When he reached the end, "You don't owe anyone an explanation, not even family," he stopped and stared at the page for a long time. Then he folded it back up carefully, like it might fall apart if he rushed. He knew, my mother whispered. Knew what I asked. That we didn't understand him, she said. That we never really tried. I didn't answer. Some things don't need help landing. We walked through the house together after that. It wasn't a tour, more like a reckoning. The garage first. My father ran his hand along the workbench, tracing the grooves worn into the wood from years of use. Tools hung in neat rows, each one in its place. "He taught me how to change a tire here," my father said almost to himself. "I forgot about that." "You didn't forget," I said. "You just stopped thinking about it." He didn't argue. My mother stood by the old radio, touching the dial gently. He used to listen to this every morning, she said. Same station, same time. You used to complain about it, my father added. She gave a small, sad smile. I remember. We moved into the living room. The chair by the window sat exactly where it always had, angled just enough to catch the afternoon light. A book lay on the side table, a bookmark still tucked between the pages. My mother picked it up, her fingers brushing the edge. He never finished this, she said. No, I replied. He didn't get the chance. The words settled over us like dust. Back in the kitchen, I set the rings down again. This is what the general said, I told them. The first ring shows he belonged, the second shows he mattered. My father nodded slowly. We treated him like he didn't belong anywhere. And like he didn't matter, my mother added, her voice breaking. I didn't soften it. That's true, I said. They didn't push back this time. They sat with it. We drove to the cemetery together that afternoon. Same road, same quiet turn past the trees, same modest gate. But this time there were 3 of us. We walked up to the grave in silence. The ground had settled a little since I'd been there last. The temporary marker stood firm, his name carved clean and simple. My mother stepped forward first. I'm sorry, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I should have come. My father stood beside her, hands clasped in front of him. I thought I had more time, he said. I kept putting it off. I won't do that again. He looked down at the ground, then at the name. You deserved better from me. I stayed a step back, letting them have that moment. It wasn't mine to take, but it was mine to witness. After a while, I stepped forward and placed the first ring on the top edge of the marker just for a second. Then I picked it back up and slipped it onto my finger. I'm keeping this, I said. Not because it's valuable, because it's his. I held up the second ring, turning it once in the light. And this, I added, I'll carry until I understand what to do with it. My father nodded. You will. Not if. Will. That mattered. We stood there a little longer. No speeches this time, no formal words. Just presence. It didn't fix everything. It didn't erase what had already happened. But it changed what came next. A small thing. But real. And when we pulled into the driveway, my father didn't go straight inside. He stood there for a moment, looking at the house like he was seeing it and the man who had lived in it for the first time in years. Wish I'd asked more questions, he said quietly. I looked at him. You still can, I said. He frowned. How? I tapped my chest lightly. By the way you live now. He held my gaze for a second, then nodded. Not fully understanding yet. But trying. That night after they left, I sat alone at the kitchen table again. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel empty anymore. I placed the second ring back in the box, then closed it gently. For now, I said, some things take time. And for the first time, time didn't feel like something we had wasted. It felt like something we might still use well. The house felt different after they left. Not louder, not brighter. Just settled. Like something that had been out of place for a long time had finally been put back where it belonged. I stayed at my grandfather's kitchen table that night longer than I needed to. The same table where he used to sit with his coffee, looking out the window like he had nowhere else to be. I set the wooden box in front of me and opened it one more time. The second ring rested inside, quiet and patient. For now, I said again, though this time it felt less like uncertainty and more like respect. Some things weren't meant to be rushed. The next morning I woke up earlier than I had in weeks. Old habits, military life doesn't let go of those easily. I made coffee the way he used to, strong, simple, no shortcuts. I even used his old mug, the one with the chipped handle he never bothered to replace. I sat by the window. Same chair, same view. Different understanding. You didn't need anyone to see it, I said quietly. You just needed to know. That was the part I hadn't fully grasped before. All those years I had thought he was small because he lived small. But he hadn't. He had lived deliberately. There's a difference. I drove back to base later that afternoon. Life didn't pause just because you finally understood something important. Orders still came in, schedules still filled up, responsibilities still waited. But I carried something new with me. Not just the rings. Perspective. A few days later, I received a short message through official channels. No details. Just a time, a location, and a name I recognized. The general. I stood outside his office again, but this time I didn't hesitate before knocking. Enter. Same voice, same calm authority. But I felt different walking in. More grounded. More certain. He looked up as I stepped inside. At ease, he said, then studied me for a moment. You've been thinking. Yes, sir. Good. He gestured toward the chair this time. Sit. I did. He rested his hands on the desk. I won't take much of your time. I just wanted to make sure you understood what you've been given. I nodded. I think I'm starting to. That's enough, he said. Understanding doesn't come all at once. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a small folder, sliding it across the desk. What's this? I asked. Nothing classified, he said. Just acknowledgement. I opened it carefully. Inside were a few documents, old, official, redacted in places. But not all. There was my grandfather's name. There were dates, operations, and one line that stood out more than anything else. Commended for actions above and beyond standard operational expectations. Individual declined formal recognition. I felt my throat tighten. He turned it down, I asked. The general nodded, every time. Why? The general leaned back slightly. Because for some men the work is the point, not the credit. I closed the folder gently. That sounded exactly like him. I also wanted to tell you something else, the general said. I looked up. Men like your grandfather don't just disappear, he said. They leave an impression. On people, on decisions, on outcomes you'll never fully see. I listened. You're part of that now, he added. I frowned slightly. Because of the rings. Because of what you choose to do with what you know he corrected. That stayed with me. When I left his office, I didn't go straight back to my quarters. I walked. Across the base, past the training fields, past the buildings I had passed 100 times before without really looking at them. Everything felt the same. But I didn't. That evening I called my parents again. Not because I had to. Because I wanted to. My mother answered this time. Hi, she said, a little unsure. Hey. A pause. Then your father's here. I figured. He picked up on the other line. Hey, he said. We weren't fixed. But we were trying. I met with the general again, I told them. And my father asked. He gave me some documents, I said. About Grandpa, not everything, but enough. My mother's voice came through softly. Was he what you said? Yes. Silence. Then my father spoke. I've been thinking about him a lot this week. Me too, I said. I keep remembering little things, he continued. Stuff I didn't think mattered at the time. It all matters, I said. I know that now. We talked a little longer. Not about everything, but about enough. It wasn't dramatic. No big apologies, no sudden breakthroughs. Just steady, honest conversation. The kind we should have been having years ago. After we hung up, I stepped outside again. The sky was clear this time, stars visible above the quiet spread of the base. I slipped the first ring onto my finger and held the second one in my hand. I think I get it now, I said softly. Not everything, but enough. A week later, I drove back to the cemetery. Alone again. But not the same kind of alone. I stood in front of the grave, the grass now beginning to grow in around the edges. I told them, I said, not everything, just enough. The wind moved gently through the trees. They came back, I added. They said what they needed to say. I paused. They're trying. That felt important. I looked down at the name carved into the stone. You didn't ask for any of this, I said, but you left it anyway. I took a breath. I'll carry it the right way. Not loudly. Not for attention. Just right. Before I left, I placed my hand on the top of the marker for a moment. Then I turned and walked back to my car. No hesitation this time. No looking back. Because some things don't need to be revisited over and over to be honored. They need to be lived forward. If you've made it this far, maybe there's someone in your life you haven't fully seen yet. Someone quiet. Someone easy to overlook. Someone you keep meaning to call or visit or understand, but haven't. Don't wait. Time doesn't always give second chances, and not every story gets told out loud. Some are carried in silence. Some are passed down in small, unnoticed ways. Until someone chooses to pay attention. If this story made you think of someone, reach out to them. If it reminded you of something you've been putting off, don't put it off again. And if you believe stories like this matter, quiet ones, real ones, consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it too. I started this alone, but I don't have to carry it that way anymore.